Welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today's story is Exploring a Derelict Colony's Deadly Secret. Join the crew as they risk it all to recover life-saving resources from a long-abandoned colony on the brink of collapse.
The derelict O'Neill cylinder loomed in the abyss, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the distant glow of the sun. A monument to human ambition, now left to an infinitely slow rot in the void. Once intended to be a beacon of civilization among the stars, it had been abandoned mid-construction, its curved shell incomplete, its systems barely functioning. And yet, even in its decay, it held something vital. Salvation for the desperate. The ship's airlock disengaged with a hollow clang, and Captain Ryland West exhaled sharply, his breath fogging against the inside of his helmet. "All right, let's move. We all know what we need to do." His voice, steady and authoritative, crackled over the comms. Beside him, Bill Reyes, the team's engineer, ran a final check on the ship's tethering clamps. "Still hard to believe this place has power," he muttered, his gloved fingers dancing over the control pad. All these years floating in the dark, something should have failed by now. Dr. Marisol Vega, the team's botanist, adjusted her mag boots, her gaze fixed on the sprawling ruin before them. Unlike the others, she didn't speak right away. The sight of the half-built station filled her with an eerie unease. In the absence of people, it should have felt dead. Sam shifted anxiously, his breathing shallow as he followed the others toward the airlock. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice," Ryland replied. Their own colony's reactor was failing. Without replacement parts, the entire settlement would collapse. The fusion coils, superconductors, and coolant regulators housed within this dead station were the only hope for their survival. Bill finished the docking sequence. "We've got a pressure seal. Power readings inside are sporadic, but the atmosphere's holding in most sections. Some areas will be vacuum, some will be less than stable." The ship's hatch opened into a yawning metal void, a long tunnel leading into the central hub of the station. Beyond it, the abandoned colony stretched out like a forgotten corpse, its rotating sections maintaining a mockery of artificial gravity. The problem was, it wasn't rotating correctly. The entire structure had an eerie, slow drift, slightly off-kilter, but this section was zero gravity. It would be a problem the further out from the center they went. Sam took an uneasy step forward, adjusting to the shift. "I don't like this." "None of us do," Ryland muttered. "Stay focused." They moved cautiously, mag boots clicking softly against the deck as they advanced. The central hub, designed to be the station's heart, was a vast zero-gravity space lined with dormant systems, unfinished walls, and patches of exposed framework where construction had abruptly halted. Loose cables dangled like the severed tendons of a once living thing. The light flickered overhead, bathing the chamber in a sickly glow before sputtering into dimness. Pockets of weightless debris floated in the vacuum, remnants of a past that had been abandoned mid-motion. Tools, storage crates, shattered visors. Signs of an exodus, a panicked one. There was a certain order to the debris slowly drifting through the void. Marisol's voice crackled through the comms. "Why did they leave in the middle of construction?" Bill's scanner flickered as he took a reading. "Radiation levels are fine, no biological contaminants, but something doesn't add up." A soft chime interrupted him. The elevator to the lower decks had power. "That's our way in," Ryland said, stepping forward. "We get to the industrial sector, find the reactor storage, get what we need, and leave." Sam hesitated before following. "Shouldn't we search for logs, see what happened here?" "No." Ryland's answer was immediate. "We don't waste time." The four of them drifted into the elevator shaft, anchoring themselves against the railing. Bill keyed in the override and the lift groaned to life. As it descended, gravity slowly took hold again, their bodies settling onto the floor in a way that felt almost normal, but not quite. The station was incomplete, The rotation of the colony provided artificial gravity, but something was off. The sensation made their stomachs lurch in discomfort. The doors hissed open into a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls here were unfinished. Exposed steel beams and half-installed polymer panels stretched ahead into the gloom. The air smelled stagnant, like an old ship sealed too long. Although they had their helmets on, they weren't using their oxygen in sections that still held atmosphere. Their helmet lights cut through the murk, revealing corridors that looked both lived in and abandoned. Bill bent down near a bulkhead, running his scanner over the metal. "What the heck? What is it?" Rylan asked. "These walls, they should be pristine, but..." He dragged his fingers over the surface. Even through his gloves he could feel it, something rough, unnatural, corrosion. Too much corrosion. Marisol knelt beside him. "It looks almost organic," she murmured, tracing the strange patterns etched into the metal. "Could be chemical exposure," Bill suggested. "Maybe some experiment went wrong before they left." "Maybe," Marisol echoed. They pressed forward. The further they walked, the worse the signs of decay became. Metal beams sagged under stress. Conduits that should have been pristine were riddled with hairline fractures. Some sections of the station were completely open to the void, hastily sealed off by emergency bulkheads. "We're walking through a graveyard with no bodies," Sam muttered, his fingers tightening around his weapon. They approached a junction where a storage room had been hastily barricaded. Crates were stacked in a makeshift blockade, but whatever had been intended to keep out was long gone. The door had been pried open. Rylan signaled for silence as he stepped inside. The space was dark. The only sound the faint hum of failing ventilation. Their helmet lights revealed something scattered across the floor. Empty spacesuits. At first it looked like discarded gear. Then they noticed the helmets were still sealed. Marisol took a slow step forward, her breath hitching. "There are no bodies." The suits weren't torn. They weren't burned. It was as if whatever had been inside them had simply vanished. Bill muttered a curse, his grip tightening around his scanner. "We shouldn't be here." "We get the parts and go," Rylan reminded them. But even he felt it now. Something had happened here. They exited the room in silence, their footsteps now wary, their movements more deliberate. Ahead, the corridor stretched toward the reactor's storage sector, their destination. Beyond it, the silence felt different. Maybe it was just the pressure difference in this section. Then, in the farthest recess of the station, so faint it could have been the ship's failing systems or a trick of the mind, a whistle. Soft, faint, almost like a distant song. Marisol froze. "Did you hear that?" No one spoke, but they all had. Ahead, the darkness stretched onward. The corridor stretched ahead in eerie silence, its dim emergency lights flickering like dying embers. The further they ventured into the colony, the more the unease in Rylan's gut solidified into something heavier. The station wasn't just abandoned, it was repurposed. Bill moved cautiously, his scanner flickering erratically. "I'm telling you, something's not right. These systems aren't just as broken, they've been changed." Marisol ran her gloved fingers over a nearby bulkhead, tracing a pattern in the metal. The corrosion wasn't random. It formed something intricate. The air smelled wrong, too, stale with a strange undertone, metallic and organic at the same time. Sam shifted uncomfortably, gripping his rifle tighter. "Changed how?" Bill hesitated before answering. "Somebody or something has been taking this place apart and putting it back together." At first glance, they seemed normal. Exposed panels, unfinished wiring, collapsed infrastructure from the station's incomplete construction. But now that she was looking for it, she saw the truth. The beams were twisted, not just by decay, but as if they'd been warped into something unnatural. Conduits were rerouted in illogical spirals. Scrap metal was stacked in perfect symmetry, forming strange, useless patterns along the walls. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered. "Why dismantle and rebuild? like this. Bill swallowed hard, because we're not the first ones here. A rhythmic hum echoed from deeper within the station. Don't move, Rylan hissed. The whistle drifted through the corridors like a ghost, warbling between the station's decaying bulkheads. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't feedback. Rylan motioned forward. Move fast, stay together. We have to keep moving. They pressed on, picking up speed, continuing their way toward reactor storage, the one place they might still salvage the fusion components they had come for. The room wasn't far. They never reached it. The world gave way beneath them. With a sickening groan, the floor collapsed, sending them into free fall as metal buckled and twisted, tearing away from the structure. Gravity spun wildly as they tumbled. Emergency lights flashed as decompression alarms screamed through the station. A deafening rush of air followed. An entire section of the superstructure had torn away, exposing them to vacuum. Marisol barely caught herself, one hand snapping onto a twisted railing as the rest of the deck vanished into the void. "Grab something!" Rylan roared over comms. Bill smashed into a support beam, his tether catching him before he was flung into space. Sam flailed, spinning weightlessly before Rylan caught him by the arm and slammed him into the nearest bulkhead. The vacuum howled, pulling at them like an invisible tide. Marisol gritted her teeth, straining against the force. A broken power conduit whipped past her, sparking violently. Below, chunks of metal floated free into the black, tumbling toward the farthest edges of the abandoned station. Then, as suddenly as it began, the bulkhead slammed shut behind them, locking the breach away. The pressure stabilized. The alarms died down, leaving behind only the deafening sound of their own ragged breathing. Bill coughed, forcing himself upright. "Well, we're not going back that way." Sam sat against the wall, chest heaving, eyes wide with shock. "That wasn't an accident," he whispered. Marisol frowned. "What?" "The way it fell apart," he said, voice shaking. "That was planned." A path had been made. Their exit was gone, and now they were forced through a narrow, winding detour, an industrial maintenance tunnel that looped through the colony's deepest corridors. Someone wanted them to take this path. Rylan checked his weapon. "We don't have a choice." He motioned ahead. "We move." They pushed forward. The further they went, the tighter the corridors became, forcing them into a claustrophobic maze of machinery and old maintenance scaffolding. Every step forward felt like a corridor closing behind them, boxing them in. And then Bill stopped dead in his tracks. His helmet light illuminated something ahead, something standing still in the dark, a figure. At first it looked human, a suit, a space suit, but there was no movement inside it. It stood rigid, as if someone had simply placed it there. The visor was cracked. Sam shuddered. "What is this?" Rylan stepped closer, rifle raised. The air grew colder. The visor reflected their lights, revealing the thing inside the suit, or what was left of it. It wasn't human anymore. A thin, black chitinous growth spread from inside the suit, its branching veins piercing through the fabric like tendrils. The face inside wasn't a skull, it wasn't bone, it was something else. Marisol turned. "We have to go." The Whistler dropped from the ceiling. That's what they were called. They'd heard rumors. The death of the lunar operations, but nothing concrete. It struck in an instant, 3 arms flashing as it slammed into Bill, dragging him into the dark. Sam screamed. Rylan fired, the round slamming into its chitinous hide, but the thing barely staggered before darting into the shadows. Bill's voice cutting off as it pulled him away. "Bill!" Marisol lunged forward, but Rylan caught her, shoving her back. "Move!" he ordered, dragging them down the corridor. The shadows came alive around them. The first wasn't alone. More of them moved just beyond the light, their pyramid-like heads tilting in eerie synchronization. Rows of eyes shimmered in the dim glow of the failing station lights. One of them stepped forward. It moved wrong, too smooth, too precise. Its hands flexed, blade-like fingers clicking against the walls, testing them. Then it lunged. The corridor became a killing ground. Ryland fired in controlled bursts, driving the creatures back as they scrambled for higher ground. Sam threw a shock charge, its electrical pulse arcing through the metal walls and stunning one of the whistlers long enough for Marisol to shove it back. They ran, boots slamming against the grated floor, weaving through twisted passageways that bent in unnatural angles, strange tunnels made with alien logic. They were designed this way. Marisol's breath caught. They built this. Ryland didn't answer. They had to keep moving. They reached a supply chamber, slamming the door shut behind them. Ryland locked the panel, his hands shaking. Sam collapsed, his face pale, drenched in sweat. "Bill's gone," he whispered. Silence. Marisol's breathing was ragged as she forced herself to stand. "The reactor parts, where are they?" They turned to the supply crates, the ones they had risked their lives for. Ryland pulled open the first one and froze. Inside, the fusion components were intact, but wrong. Each one had been carefully dismantled and reassembled to look right at first glance, but were wrong. The circuits were rewired to fail, the coils were corrupted, the coolant tainted. The whistlers had let them find the parts, let them believe they had a reason to press on. The realization sank in. They were never meant to leave. The station had been a trap all along. The mission had failed. Now all they had to escape with their lives. The corridors vibrated with the distant hum of machinery, a low, mechanical breath that should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Ryland's grip tightened around his weapon as they moved through the failing station, their boots whispering against the grated floors. The colony wasn't just breaking down. It was being remade. Marisol moved in front, guiding them through the dim, emergency-lit hallways. Sam followed, still rattled, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. They had lost Bill. The mission was a failure. And yet, they had no choice but to keep moving. Ryland checked their surroundings. They had entered the central hub, a massive circular control chamber meant to oversee the entire colony's life support and industrial systems, the beating heart of the station. It should have been their safest refuge. Instead, it felt like a mausoleum. Marisol gasped, "Oh, no." Ryland followed her gaze. The walls had changed. What should have been sleek, unfinished steel was now veined with black chitin, glistening with bioluminescent fluid. Structures that had once been walkways and control consoles had been reshaped, fused into grotesque organic metal hybrids. And at the center, growing like a tumorous mass, was the machine. It was massive, a pulsating construct of interwoven alien tendrils and machinery. Cables snaked from it, burrowing into the colony's power grid like parasites. The whistlers were building something. The structure pulsed rhythmically, a deep, throbbing hum filling the chamber. Energy surged through it, feeding whatever it was becoming. "Well, pretty sure that doesn't come standard," Sam whispered. Marisol approached cautiously, brushing dust from a terminal. The old human tech was still partially functional, flickering to life under her fingers. She began cycling through logs, power readouts, sensor feeds, anything that could tell them what the whistlers were doing. Then she froze. "Ryland," she murmured, "these readings are insane." Sam backed up, shaking his head. "That thing is—" "What? A generator? A weapon?" Ryland stared at the structure, its surface rippling slightly, as though alive. "We don't stay to find out," he said. Then the whistling began, the doors sealed shut behind them, and the whistlers descended. The first dropped from the ceiling, landing with graceful, inhuman precision. The others emerged from shadows, peeling away from the walls, stepping into the eerie glow of their grotesque creation. Marisol barely had time to pull back as the nearest whistler lunged, its bladed limbs flashing toward her. Ryland fired. The shot slammed into its exoskeleton, staggering it but not stopping it. The creature adjusted, tilting its head, as if recalculating the fight in real time. Sam opened fire, rounds tearing through the creatures. But they moved fast, too fast, darting between columns, using the environment like trained hunters. Ryland took down one with a shot to the neck, the alien gurgling as blue-green fluid sprayed onto the floor. The low-pressure environment causing their fluid to spray out in a high-pressure stream. Another came from the side. He barely dodged in time. Marisol was forced back against the terminal, her torch igniting in a desperate attempt to keep the creatures at bay. The lights flickered, the power surged, and the machine came alive. The mass at the center of the chamber flared, tendrils unfurling as the energy flowing through it spiked. The whistlers stopped attacking. They fell silent, watching. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, they stepped back, not retreating, but waiting. The machine's pulse deepened. Marisol's screen glitched. Then they heard it, a voice, not human, not even Whistler. Ryland's stomach twisted. Then we destroy it. Sam barely had time to react before Ryland grabbed a high-yield charge from his pack. The whistlers moved, too late. Ryland hurled the explosive into the mass of writhing cables and fired. The explosion ripped through the chamber. The scant atmosphere in the station muffled the flames. The machine detonated, sending a wave of heat and shrapnel that tore apart the whistlers closest to it. The human survivors ran, weaving through debris, scrambling toward the emergency exit. Behind them the station groaned, power failing section by section as the destruction spread. The organic tendrils twitched violently, the whistlers screaming in that eerie, mechanical wail as the station shuddered around them. They made it to the docking bay just as the structure began a slow collapse. The exterior of the station began to spin out into space, the rotating, flinging parts of itself into oblivion. The airlock sealed behind them with a heavy, final clang. Ryland slumped against the bulkhead, his chest heaving. Marisol stared out the viewport as their ship pulled away. The colony's central hub was failing, sparks flaring as power grids overloaded, entire sections shutting down. Lights winking out, then going dark forever. Sam, still gripping his rifle, sat in shaken silence. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Marisol exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "That wasn't just a machine," she whispered. "That was something else." Ryland stared at the colony, now just a dark silhouette in the void. The whistlers had been building something, and they had interrupted it. But for what purpose? And more importantly, had they stopped it? Or had they set something in motion that couldn't be undone? The ship vanished into the dark, leaving the ruined colony behind. Somewhere deep within its failing systems, the last remnants of the Whistler's creation pulsed. One final time.
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to Free Science Fiction Stories for daily sci-fi adventures.